Mining. Okay, so that's the next part. If we had access to a trustworthy centralized service, the system would be trivial to implement. Well, of course, this central service will mint. It could simply be coded exactly as described using a centralized server hard drive to keep track of the state. So mining means you're creating coins. So he's saying here that if you have a centralized service, that service can create the coins and keep track of who has them. However, with Bitcoin, we are trying to build a decentralized currency system. So we will need to combine the state transition system with a consensus system in order to ensure that everyone agrees on the order of transactions. Okay, so the key point here is a consensus system. So it's a pretty big word to say that you need a system to make people agree on something. So consensus is agreeing, right? And many things have to be agreed on. So of course we need to agree on who has the coins, and that derives from the transactions. So we have to agree on which transactions are valid, and transactions are sometimes depending on each other. So if I spend a coin and I pay somebody, and then that somebody wants to pay somebody else, then it's important that my transaction goes before his transaction. So that is about ordering, right? So in order to ensure that everyone agrees on the order of transactions, right? Bitcoin decentralized consensus process requires nodes in the network to continuously attempt to produce packages of transactions called blocks. So we finally hear about the blocks. So the idea here is that you will have transactions floating around, but from time to time they will be packaged. They will be put in the block. So the block would be a series of transactions that's supposed to come in that order, and that block is then attached to the blockchain, right? So he has a picture. There's a picture of the block here, and what it says here is that you have this block, for example, 5,625. It has a timestamp. So this number here is a number of seconds since a reference time. It has the transactions. So there will be a list of transactions here, and that's the payload. That's the content, important content of the block. But there is some accounting data in the header. So the time, and this previous hash. So this is, did you see what is the hash here? Okay, maybe later. And the nonce in the hash will probably be explained in this article. Okay, the network is intended to produce roughly one block every 10 minutes, with each block containing a timestamp, a nonce, and a reference to, i.e. hash of the previous block, and the list of all the transactions that have taken place since the previous block. So that's this guy here, right? So timestamp we know. He doesn't really say what's the this hash, right? So the hash here is relative to the hash cache function. So a hash is simply, I think I've said it many times, a hash is simply a function that takes input a series of bytes or bits, and outputs another series of bytes. But the input has arbitrary length, and the output will always be the same length. It depends on the hash. And the other property is that that hash, if it's large enough, if the length of that hash is big enough. So for Bitcoin, it's 32 bytes. So 256 bits. And so this is just a portion of the hash. The hash is much longer than that, right? And the hash is such that if you have the hash, you will not be able to find any data that would be producing the same hash. So it's fairly unique. Obviously, theoretically, it is not unique because since the input is arbitrary length, the space of the space by space, the amount of the count of possible inputs is infinite, whereas the output is limited to 32 bytes. So it's a large number. It's 2 power 256. So it's a very large number. That's the 10 power 77 that about 10 power 77 that we talked about. But it's obviously less than infinity. So there are bound to be infinite number of collisions of inputs that should hash the same output. But these functions were designed so that it's extremely hard to find one. And if you can find one, if there's a collision that is found, then the hash function will be retired, will be disqualified. So the idea here is that the block itself, if you put it into this grinder, if you want, it will produce this hash, and then that hash would then be put in the next block. So obviously you cannot predict you cannot predict your own hash, obviously, because if you put your hash into your own block, the result will be another hash, right? So this is gonna keep on going on forever. Since you're hashing that value, you cannot have, you will change the hash by inserting the hash that you find inside your own block. So the hash actually will be part of the next block, right? So this is what's going on here. So we have a reference to the previous hash, so the block coming from here is 5623, and then that whole block will have a hash value that we will put into the next block, right? And this forms the blockchain. So what's the role of the nonce? So the nonce here is to have some influence on the resulting hash. Whenever you change the nonce, since it's part of the block, you will have a different hash result. You will have a different hash. Since a block will be accepted if the hash value is lower than the threshold as dictated by the current difficulty, this is your way to, the miner's way to influence the resulting hash and get a qualifying block. So the network is intended to produce a block every 10 minutes, we said. That's the self-adjusting property of the protocol. So every 2016 blocks, that's about 2 weeks, the protocol will take a look at all these timestamps and see if the blocks were produced faster or slower than the targeted 10 minutes. So if it's produced faster than 10 minutes, it means that it was too easy to produce blocks, which means that the difficulty was not high enough. And there's a formula that will adjust the difficulty accordingly. So everybody in the network, every node will follow the same rules and will adjust the difficulty. So that doesn't require any centralized decision. Just by observing the past, we can all agree, or all the nodes can agree on the future, on the next value of the difficulty, and that happens every 2016 blocks. And of course, if it's the other way around, if the blocks are produced too slowly, it means that it was too hard to find a good nonce. Therefore, the difficulty is too high, and the network will lower the difficulty. Okay. And that's what I said. Over time, this creates a persistent, ever-growing blockchain. Finally, we talk about blockchain that constantly updates to represent the latest state of the Bitcoin ledger. Okay. The algorithm for checking if the block is valid, expressed in this paradigm, is as follows. Okay, check if the previous block referenced by the block exists and is valid. So you receive, they say you receive this block, and you want to know if this block is okay, right? So first of all, it should have the previous hash. So you are supposed to have received all these guys before, and you want to know if you should take that new guy. So you know the hash of the block before, and your new block must contain that hash. Okay, check that the timestamp of the block is greater than of the previous block and less than 2 hours into the future. So I think this rule is actually, I'm not sure if it's true. Yeah, it's not exactly true. So there is a there's a caveat here. It says that the timestamp should be timestamp after this one, and not too far in the future. So that's something to prevent miners from like basically playing with the clock. The problem is that you cannot agree on the clock because every system is on a different location, and there's no central notion of time. But we still need a timestamp, and that timestamp is actually not used per se by the protocol. It doesn't really matter, but it's there to decide whether it's there to calculate the difficulty, right? Because we said that we aim for 10 minutes between blocks, so you need a timestamp, and you don't want the block to be the timestamp of the block to be completely crazy. But on the other hand, you cannot decide exactly what is the reference time. So there's some leeway in the protocol, and that's the details are here. There's not super interesting to know the details, but that's the idea behind this. Check that the proof of work on the block is valid. So that means that you take the block, you hash it. You take the block content, you calculate the hash. Well, actually, it's only the block head. You hash it, and then you figure out if the resulting value is lower than the threshold as decided by the difficulty, as determined by the difficulty. So let S0 be the state at the end of the previous block. Sure. And suppose CX is the block transactions list with n transaction. So in this guy here, we have n transactions, right? And then we do for all I in 0 and minus 1. So there's n transactions. So it goes from 0 to n minus 1 inclusive. And you apply the transaction. Okay, so that is actually a fancy way to say that you just apply each transaction one after the other. And if you have, if at any point you get an error, then the whole block is an error. You don't try to exclude individual transactions. So it's whoever has done this block should have checked before that the transactions that are included are valid. If you put a wrong transaction that it has a problem, and then you start searching the nonce, even if you get a good value and you spend all this electricity looking for correct nonce, but you have a transaction that is invalid or even one, then you have wasted all that energy because that block would be rejected, and that has happened. So this is something to bear in mind if you are a miner. So this is if everything went through, return true, and register the final state as SN, the final state as the state at the end of this block. Okay. So essentially, each transaction in the block must provide a valid state transition from what was the canonical state before the transaction was executed to some new state. Note that the state is not encoded in the block in any way. It is purely an abstraction to be remembered by the validating node and can only be securely computed for any block by starting from the genesis state and sequentially applying every transaction in every block. Additionally, note that the order in which the miner includes transactions into the block matters. If there are two transactions A and B in the block, such as B spends the UTXO created by A, then the block will be valid if A comes before B, but not otherwise. So two things to notice here. So let's start with the second one. Is that we said that the order of the transactions is important, especially if you have a chain of spending. So if you have two guys that spend to two different people, so one not related, it doesn't matter if the transactions are in any order. But if you have two transactions that are actually depending on each other, so you pay somebody and that person pays somebody else, then it's important that the second transaction is in the block after the first one. So the order, sometimes the order matters. So it's better be safe than sorry, and make sure that the miners have to make sure that the transactions are in the right order. And the implication is that you can have UTXO. You can have a UTXO created and then destroyed inside the same block. Right, that's the example that we talked about. Okay, now for the first step, the first point. Sorry. That it says that the state, this S0, Sn, or whatever, right? All these intermediate states. So basically, knowing at a given point what are the UTXOs, right? This is basically the state that you will have that you have to keep, is in order to apply a transaction. To know if you have to find the input, right? So of the transaction. So you have to find the UTXO, and the biggest set of data that you need to keep in the state is a UTXO set. That set itself is not in the blockchain, and you have to if you are a node, you have to compute it. You have to derive it. By applying all these transactions one after the other. The only point in time where we know for sure what is the UTXO is the initial state, which is called the genesis block. The genesis state just means that you have nothing, nobody has anything, and the first block will be creating the first 50 bitcoins and giving these 50 bitcoins to the first address. So from there you can build everything else. Everything else derived from the first block, the genesis state, and the genesis state has the first block hash. So block 0, which is the genesis block, obviously doesn't have a previous hash, and it has an arbitrary. I think it has actually it has a hash itself, and that hash is the hash that you have to trust. It's the hash of this Bitcoin chain. So this is basically the beginning of time for Bitcoin. So this, you have to be the network will hard code that particular hash, the genesis hash, and then from block 1 you can verify that block 1 has actually a hash that you have hard coded. If you have you can create another blockchain just by creating another genesis block. Okay, so we're good here, right? The one validity condition present in the above list that is not found in other systems is the requirement for proof of work. The precise condition is that the double SHA-256 hash of every block, treated as a 256-bit number, must be less than a dynamically adjusted target, which at the time of this running is approximately 2 power 187. So 2 power 187 is really high, but it's still much lower than 2 power 256. So the difference here is basically roughly the number of hashes that you will have to compute before you have a match. The purpose of this is to make block creation computationally hard, thereby preventing cyber attackers from remaking the entire blockchain in their favor. Okay, cyber attackers. So cyber attack is when a bunch of guys impersonate. So you own a bunch of machines, and you make all these machines act on your behalf, but pretending to be independent, and that's essentially what's a cyber attack. So in this decentralized network, it's very important to prevent this, because since the system is anonymous, you could have a centralization without you knowing about it. just because central authority, let's say a big like a government or a big corporation hires a bunch of people acting on their behalf, and they would all pretend to be independent nodes, right? There's no way, since they don't have name and they don't have any registry, there's no way for anybody to know that they are working for the same person or the same entity. Because SHA-256 is designed to be a completely unpredictable pseudo-random function, the only way to create a valid block is simply trial and error, repeatedly increasing the nonce and seeing if the new hash matches. So SHA-256 is the name of this hash function, and Bitcoin actually does double SHA. So double SHA is simply you hash the block, and then you get the first hash value, and then that hash value is hashed again with the same SHA-256 function. So the hash of the hash. There is no real crypto reason to do that actually. There is reason to do a double hash, but as far as I know, it doesn't increase the security for this particular purpose, but it doesn't really hurt either. Right? So that's the way Satoshi defined the proof of work. So now you have to do it. Everybody had to do the same. And so here it's a completely unpredictable pseudo-random function. Okay, so the few things that are interesting here is function, right? So function means that given one input, you have actually it should be deterministic function, but a function here means you take input and you have output. You give the same input, you get the same output. But it's pseudo-random, so it's not random, meaning of course because as we said, if you put the same input, you would have the same output. But it looks random. So if you take all the outputs and then you do a statistical analysis, for example, you send a million inputs, that like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and to a million. So it's really ordered, right? So in a whole space, 1 million is really concentrated in one place. You don't do like 1 and then 60 billion and then, right? So it's really concentrated. But your output, the output of this SHA-256 would be all over the place, and it will look as if it's uniformly random. So it would be a lot of different numbers, 1 million numbers, of course, but all these numbers will be like all over the place, and you won't notice any pattern. And that's the unpredictable part. So since there's no way for you or for anybody to predict the pattern, the only way to find a hash that fits into the condition. So imagine that basically you're throwing darts and you're throwing darts at the forest, but you have to hit one tree, right? Because the tree is where when the nonce will be accepted, right? So we're saying that the hash has to be lower than about this number. So you have 256 possible location where your dart will land, but only 2 power 187 would be acceptable. So these numbers are extremely large. So it's kind of like hitting a dot when you throw the stuff completely at random. And the only way for you to actually reach that goal is to throw a ton of darts, right? So this is what miners do. They repeatedly increase the nonce, and then might as well do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because it's not like you have any way that is smarter than that. You do 1, you get the hash. It doesn't give you any idea of what would be a better nonce than 2, because of this unpredictable pseudo-random property. At the current target of 2 power 187, the network must make an average of 2 power 69 tries. So the 69 comes from 256 minus 187. Before a valid block is found, in general, the target is recalibrated by the network every 2016 blocks, yeah, so that on average, a new block is produced by some node in the network every 10 minutes. Okay, that's what we were actually saying earlier. So I guess, okay, that's what it's talking about. In order to compensate miners for this computational work, the miner of every block is entitled to include the transaction given themselves 12.5 BTCs out of nowhere. So this is the only transaction that can be included in the block that doesn't take inputs. And actually that transaction must be the first one in the block. It's called a Coinbase transaction. And the reward for the Coinbase used to be 50, but then it halved to 25. Now it halved to 12.5 at the time of the writing, and it will keep halving on every, I don't know, a certain number of blocks, but I forgot how many. And also the miner will collect any fee. So the transaction has a sum of input that must be greater than the sum of outputs, but the difference will be given to the miner. So if you don't provide any fee, so you are when you make a transaction, you decide what fee you want to give, right? So that is by basically tipping the transaction, tipping the miner. You give a little bit more money in the or a little less output than input, and the miner can collect that. Incidentally, this is also the only mechanism by which BTC are issued. The Genesis state contains no coins at all, right? So the first block, Genesis block, starts with an empty state. So the block itself applies the state from the block before, which has nothing. So the first block will have has a Coinbase and no transaction, because before there was no UTXO at all. So the first block by definition cannot have any transaction besides the Coinbase. After that, possibly the second block, well, the third block, because Genesis is the second block could have a transaction using the previous Coinbase account, and it has also its own Coinbase. So the second block may have two transactions, right? One Coinbase and one transaction, and then it goes on and on. In order to better understand the purpose of mining, let us examine what happens in the event of a malicious attacker. Since Bitcoin underlying cryptography is known to be secure, the attacker will target the one part of the Bitcoin system that is not protected by cryptography directly, the order of transactions. The attacker's strategy is simple, right? So this is going to be double spending, I guess. Spend 100 BTC to a merchant in exchange for some product, okay? Wait for the product, right? And produce another transaction sending the same 100 BTC to himself, and try to convince the network that his transaction to himself was the one that came first, right? All right, so that's a double spend, right? You have this the attacker has this 1 BTC, but he wants to spend it at some store, and he wants to spend it and send it to himself. So obviously the second transaction, even though it's sent to himself, since every account is anonymous, there is no way for the network to know that he is actually sending it to himself, right? So so he wants to do 2 before 1, so that the network does not know which one of these 2 transactions is the good one, right? Once step 1 has taken place, after a few minutes, some miner will include the transaction in the block, say block 270. Okay. After about 1 hour, 5 more blocks will have been added to the chain after that block. So it's 5 more because it's 1 block every 10 minutes. So it should be 6 actually. Which each of those blocks indirectly pointing, I guess he counts the block that is currently being produced, which each of those blocks are indirectly pointing to the transaction and thus confirming it. Okay, so why is this block indirectly pointing to the transaction? It's because all these blocks, so you have 5 blocks that are produced after the block that includes transaction. Each of these blocks will have a hash that links to the previous hash. So meaning that if you change the transaction of the block, the current block 270, then it would change that hash. Then the next block will have to include that hash. So therefore its content would have changed. Therefore its hash would have changed, and so on and so forth for the remaining one. So it's cascading. If you change anything in the blockchain, you will change everything that comes afterwards. Otherwise, if you just change one block and leave the rest of the guys behind, then they will be basically pointing to void, because your block, the block that you have changed, has a different hash, and the block that is following will not point to your new hash. Okay, at this point, the merchant will accept the payment as finalized, because if you're good, if you're cautious, you know that accepting one block may be tricky, because you could have several miners getting a good nonce and producing blocks that are, if you are a miner and you just accept the block right away and then you deliver the goods, you have the risk that another miner produces a block that is also valid. So then they are indistinguishable because they both contain a nonce that is correct. So these two blocks are actually like siblings and both valid. And the network would follow one of them. So you could have some of the nodes following the first block and some of the other nodes following the second block. And it's not safe for eventually this is gonna be resolved, and one of the two branches or the two forks will become the main line. But you would, as a vendor, you take the risk that it's the block that doesn't have your transaction, if that wins, and you end up not being paid. So most of not most, but some of the vendors will prefer to have more confirmations than just one. So at this point, the merchant will accept the payment as finalized, because now he has seen like 6 confirmations, right? And deliver the product, since we're assuming that this is digital goods, delivery is instant. Now the attacker creates another transaction sending the 100 BTC to himself. If the attacker simply releases it into the wild, the transaction will not be processed, right? Because the transaction is double spanning the UTXO. The UTXO was spent on transaction 1, and therefore has been removed from the set. So the second transaction comes and will fail because of the rule where the rule here, if the reference UTXO is not in the set, return an error. Right? So this will return error. Oopsie daisy. Okay. Alright, so we're here. The miners will attempt to apply the function, and notice that TX consumes UTXO, which is no longer in the state. So actually the miner will just not find it, so it doesn't know if it was there or not. The entry, the UTXO, was deleted. So as long as the miner is concerned, whether it was in the UTXO before or not doesn't matter. It just it's not a valid UTXO because it's not in the state. So instead, the attacker creates a fork of the blockchain. Okay, so this is where it becomes tricky. He does not try to put his transaction at the end, because he knows that transaction is using a UTXO that's been spent. But he has to try to attach his transaction at the point where the UTXO was still there. So he creates a fork, right? So at block 270, that transaction the transaction 1 didn't happen yet, right? But now he's trying to create a second block. Because the block data is different, because he has changed the block. The block data is different. He will have a different hash, right? And if he has a different hash, that means the nonce is no longer valid, right? So he will have to redo the proof of work. He will have to try several nonces, like 263 nonces, so quite a lot of nonces, to make a block that can be attached to 269. So he has created a new 270 basically, right? So he has created a new 270, and his new 270 has to also be valid as far as the blockchain protocol is designated. So his new block has also to have a nonce, and to get a nonce you have to work. Proof of work means you have to calculate nonces, and you have to calculate hashes, and that requires electricity. So you have to pedal a lot basically to do this stuff. But he has done a new 270, and obviously his new block will have a different hash, but a hash that is also valid, so below the difficulty threshold, but a different hash. So therefore 271 to 275, the other guys will have a hash that not refer to his, right? The 271 to 275 is still connected to the older block 270, right? So now what do we have? We have old 270 to 275, which is the normal blockchain, and you have this fork, this new 270, which is a kind of a little fork, right? It's not very long. It only has one block, right? So you have the original chain that is the same from 0 to 269, and then it forks to two different 270s, one that goes to 275 and one that stays at 270. The rule is that the rule is that in a fork, the longest blockchain is taken to be the truth. So this is where there's a rule that we didn't talk about, which is which chain. So the miners will see this, like not miners, but the network, assuming that this attacker then diffuses, broadcast his new block 270. Then the nodes will receive it, and they will see that there's two forks, right? Two chains. So which one now is the good one? And the protocol will say that you should follow the fork that has the highest amount of work, right? So it's not necessarily the longest, but it has the most amount of work, and the amount of work is defined by the threshold. So you just sum all the it's not related to the hash that you have produced, but it's related, it's the hash that you have to be below, the threshold that you have to be below. Okay, so let's see that in a different way. So if you have a block that says you need to find a hash that is below it's actually the reverse, so it's going to be interesting. So if you have a block that says you need to in average generate 2 power 69 blocks, 269 tries before finding a block, right? So I'm saying that again. If you have a block that has a difficulty such as in average you will need 2 power 69 tries to generate a proper hash, then you have produced 2 power 69 units of work. So you could be very lucky and it could be like a first try, but you are still gonna have proven that you have worked 2 power 69. And the reason for that is actually quite tricky, so we're not going to discuss this here. Why not say that it's the hash that you produce that represents the work? That's simply put, it's that you have hit the target, but whether you hit the target bullseyes or you hit the target on the side, doesn't matter. You have proven that you have hit the target, and it's a binary decision, so you are rewarded that proof of work. That's another way to say it. And that's okay. Let's not enter the details for why it's like that. But the reason why this rule is there is not only the longest chain, right? Is because if you artificially just say that it's the longest chain, if you just say it's the longest chain and not the chain has a highest amount of work, the guy who did block 270 could produce more blocks, because since he's in charge, he has done blocks 270, and he's the only guy mining on it, right? So let's say that for a while he mines, and then he mines like 10 blocks, right? So, or 2,000 blocks. So at that point, he can start playing on the difficulty readjustment, and he could potentially lower the difficulty so that it's much easier for him to mine blocks on his chain. And when he reaches a point where he basically can create blocks super fast, he could make a chain that has such a low difficulty that he can produce thousands and thousands of blocks, right? And then he can outrun the real blockchain. So that's not really fair, because he didn't really do that much work. So the blockchain length doesn't really matter. It's how much work was put into making that blockchain, that chain, that matters. In order for the attacker to make his blockchain the longest, he would need to have more computational power than the rest of the network combined in order to catch up. Right? So this is what we were saying. Since he trying to make blocks, but his block has to produce the same proof of work than the other ones. So basically, he has to have spend, in average, probabilistic speaking, as much power as other guys, because the other guys also try as hard as they can to produce chains, right? So he has to overcome the other guys. So he has to provide work that is equivalent to the other guys. And if he wants to pass them, he has to provide more. Therefore, it's 51% attack. So 51% attack, it's not like you have 51% and then you win. It's more like if you have 51% more so of the computational power. So in theory, you will beat the guy, the rest of the network in average, right? So it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that you're gonna be finding the hash every time, but it means that in average you would find more than half of the hashes. Okay, so now we talk about Merkle trees. Okay, Merkle trees also needs their own video, so I'm gonna stop here again.